What up, yo? It's your boy Wavy Wayne. I first just want to thank y'all so much for watching the videos, supporting the channel. You know I do it for you, baby. Alright? Want to make sure y'all engineering game get up. But I did just drop a brand new website, wavywayne.com. Alright? This is the way that you can help to support me so I can keep these videos coming. So there's wavywayne.com. I got engineer swag, some t-shirts, some sauce t-shirts, some Pro Tools pimping shirts, and I also have some Pro Tools templates that you can use to help you get started in your sessions and, you know, take your mixes to the next level. So visit wavywayne.com, help support the channel, and keep this thing moving, all right? Now, let's check out this video. What up, y'all? This your boy Wavy Wayne, back again with another Wavy Way tip of the day. And I got a special guest this time, man. I got the mastering man himself here to answer all your mastering questions, so y'all can quit bugging me. My hair about to come out. Y'all keep asking me about mastering. I get a lot of questions from my clients. Do you mix and master? How much you charge for mastering? What is mastering? And you know, I just want to make sure I'm giving them the right answer. So, Ben, go ahead. First of all, Ben Kesler, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely, I appreciate you having me.
I'm sure that you know, the audience, the YouTube community is gonna really get a lot out of this for sure. I actually have some questions myself, so I'm glad you're here. Let's go ahead and jump into some questions. First thing first, Ben, how did you get into mastering?
All right, so I started out as producer engineer, multi-instrumentalist, was creating records for bands. And what I found is as I was sending my stuff off to the mastering engineer, sometimes it wasn't quite coming back exactly how I had envisioned it. You know, 10, 15 years ago, we were dealing with lots of loudness wars. So either I'd get something back that was destroying the dynamics of my mix, and it was just sounded awful, or it was the opposite. I would send it to an, you know, some sort of audio purist, and it would come back, and it wasn't sounding like quite the levels of everyone else, and it just sounded small in comparison. So it was part out of just trying to demystify what this is. I mean, it was so expensive to master, and I didn't always feel like I was getting the best result for my music. So it kind of started out as a journey trying to get my music to sound better, but also I realized I was leaving a lot of money on the table. Clients were asking if I could master, and I'm just like, maybe, I don't know. Can I? I don't know. And it just it became for me a process of almost what I'd call pseudo mastering, just getting my songs to sound halfway decent, you know, with one another, working together as a compilation, and then to the point where now most of my work is mastering for either clients or even other engineers. I work with a lot of mix engineers that send me a lot of their work on a consistent basis. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Okay. So you saying you was getting like some bad masters sometimes that you weren't happy with?
It just wasn't what I sent off. It was coming back too different for me, and it was so expensive. Especially, it's gotten cheaper now, but it was, you know, you're paying
$10 on Ladder. I don't know if I recommend that, but you could. There's some places you could upload it and download it right back.
And those are competing with kind of presets. Those are competing with, you know, putting an ozone preset or something in. So there is a genuine purpose for that, a genuine use for that. But yeah, but you know, when we were paying $150, $200 an hour, and the mastering engineer was taking half day, all day to turn something back to you, and you weren't exactly happy with it, and you weren't exactly sure about, you know, how to go about revisions. Were you allowed to ask the mastering engineer to change things? And so I just felt this need that I couldn't afford to do that every single time. So I needed to figure out how to make it work for myself, and kind of developed a process that worked for me, and ultimately started working for others.
So what should be the job of a mastering engineer? What should a mastering engineer do when you send them their record?
Yeah, so it's constantly evolving. So that word is really changing, and the definition of what a mastering engineer is keeps on changing. the goal for me, I'm almost what you would call a pre-mastering engineer. My focus is really on the music itself. So I'm taking the mixes, the final mixes that someone else is giving to me, and I'm making sure that they are all going to translate on the medium that they're intended for, whether that's going to be online, downloads. Is that going to be a streaming service? Is that going to, are we prepping it for vinyl? And ultimately, even more importantly than that, is making sure they work together as a compilation. So, so often you'll get an album where it has, 8 different mix engineers on it, and everyone has their different tastes. How is this going to work together as a project that makes sense? And so that, to me, is my main goal. Also, part of the mastering duty is, if you're releasing it on CD, is to embed codes to do sequencing and stuff like that. Although with digital distribution, that is becoming to a point where it's not always the mastering engineer that's doing that. Can be, but it's not. Sometimes clients don't want to pay for that. They'd rather just let the digital distribution service do some of those things.
Yeah, like TuneCore or something, they will kind of embed the...
Yeah, absolutely. So you can just upload your waves to TuneCore, and they can add they would assign ISRC codes and such like that. But if you provided them to your mastering engineer, they could do the sequencing and everything for you, and you could just, either way. So it depends.
Cool. When would you say I need to get something mastered? Like, is it, during the mix, once I have a single? Should it be the whole album? Like, when is mastering necessary?
So I have a strong preference, but in reality, I don't always get it this way. But 15 times out of 10, I would prefer if you sent me all of the songs together, because that's how I can really make them work together. Part of my process is initial transfers, but then I'm going to pull them all together into one session, one DAW, listen to them together back to back, make little adjustments compared to one another. It's really hard if you're doing just a standalone song and then you have others to make it all work. Now, that being said, lots of my clients want to release singles first, and so I will master singles at a time, and then once I have the rest, we'll put them all together. That, to me, works not quite as well as getting them all at the same time. I always give the disclaimer, I can release a single for you, I can have a single ready for you, but I may have to do it again.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask.
So it may be a different master for a slightly different master for the single than for the project. And as long as the client understands that and you've made that clear, it can work either way.
Cool. So like we were talking about sites like Lander and other this kind of drive-through mastering. Do you think that mastering is as crucial as it once was, or has it changed its in relevancy, or should the mix engineer just be able to finish their mix and put it out?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's as relevant as it ever is. I just think the duty of the mastering engineer is really changing. So it's less about putting it on a different medium or providing it for a medium. Rather, it's just another set of ears is the biggest thing that a mastering engineer is. So.
And we missing that now because now nobody's listening to the music before it goes out, right, except the creator. Exactly.
So what's great is that the cost of equipment's come down, that people can do, like, all that stuff is great. I love it. But, man, to have someone that's trained, that's been listening to music for years, to, check and be like, okay, this is going to work or this isn't going to work, is very, very important. You got to keep in mind that the speakers back here go down to 26 hertz. I mean, your speakers that you're mixing on aren't going down to... I can hear things on that just because of the equipment I have, that you're not because I'm a better person or anything, but simply because of the equipment we have and the analyzation tools we have, etc. So for nothing else, getting another pair of ears on it is very, very important. But again, with all the different mix engineers, it really takes a qualified person to make all the songs work together in a compilation.
Yeah, because I've heard some engineers say that They have like they don't trust their, just like you started mastering because you didn't necessarily get the results you wanted from other mastering engineers, so you went about it yourself. And I've heard that before, where like, yo, if I've finished the mix, I'm a mix engineer, why do I need to have somebody else touch my mix ultimately,
and so I mean ultimately I would say that I don't feel like I became good at mastering overnight. So it took me a long time to kind of develop a process that worked and sounded good. And also, you got to keep in mind, I hadn't just mixed a few records at that point. Like, I'd been working for years in the industry and just listening a lot. And that's really what all mastering is. It's really critically listening to every single thing and being able to both listen musically for what's going on, but also just, I mean, weird stuff that if you're really married to the music, attached to the music, that you may not hear. Weird sounds, weird clicks, weird, everything. Like with your, if you got a bad edit and it somehow made it through your mixing stage, it's just going to get worse in mastering. And a lot of times I'll catch those things before I even master it, and I'll actually send it back to the mix engineer. I'm not going to take their money until, it's ready to go. Or, the snare is ridiculous. It's like 4 times louder than anything else. Like, please turn it down. Something like, that I'm going to send it back to the mix engineer and get
would you say, like, as a mastering engineer, would you say that you could like skip being a mix engineer and jump right into mastering engineer, being a master? Like,
I mean, I would think that would be extremely difficult. I would, maybe you don't have to be a mastering engineer or a mixing engineer first, but you have to do something where you're critically listening to music for years and years, I would think, before for me.
So don't trust no 19-year-old master. I master your records. I just graduated from one of them schools.
Some people will come out of, instead of a mixing background, will come out of like a archival or transferring background, like where they're, working for, a Library of Congress, or they're working for a huge studio where they're really just, preserving content for history, and they've gotten so used to listening to things critically for distortion and things like that they've gotten into mastering. So that's another kind of route into it, but I just can't imagine anyone getting into mastering without years of listening to music, and more than just listening like, oh, I love the song, it feels great, to like critically listening.
Makes sense. It's called mastering. Like, got to be a master. All right. So, how what's an ideal session like? How should one package a session and send it to a mastering engineer? Like, would you prefer just people sending it to you? Do you want the clients in the room? Like,
that's going to be based on personal preference too. I do almost all of my stuff unattended, but a lot of that's because I'm working with out-of-town clients. And I love that because I get to work on my own free schedule. The only problem with...
Changed it up. 2 dB on the 10K.
But the bad thing about that is you have a tendency to have more revisions that way. Because if you could have someone in the room with you and just say, that's too bright, and that's just more of a personal preference than a fact. Like, it is too bright because it's more of a personal preference, and that kind of stuff could just be fixed right then and there. Yeah. However, most people that are coming to me now are because they trust what they've heard something I've done, or they've used me before, and so I feel pretty good about doing stuff unattended. If it is an attended session, that's fine too. What I can't stand is when it's hard enough to mix or record when people are talking, but man, if you're mastering and people are talking and carrying on conversations and
watching Netflix,
Snapchatting, the whole thing, it gets distracting.
Okay, so when you come to your mastering session, don't bring your entourage. Sit down and be quiet till you got in a suggestion, right? So, what kind of format should the files be in? Should the sessions? Do you want full sessions? Should it be?
I don't want full sessions. I will do stem mastering if it really calls for it, but I really don't even like to do that. It complicates the process. I really want waves. I want the final mix as a wave, and I want the highest quality you recorded at. So if you record it at 24-bit 48, keep it at 24-bit 48. There's no sonic improvement to upsample it, but please don't downsample it. Just keep it at where it was. I'll be able to import it at that rate, work at that rate, and then bounce it out to what you need. But highest quality wave, I don't want an MP3. Please, no limiting on your master. Let me do the limiting because I want to compress before I do the limiting, and so I really want to have the flexibility of doing that. So the most common things that I send back, like, hey, I'm not going to work on this, is if someone sends me an MP3, unless that's all they have and it has to, it's emergency. But I won't master an MP3. I won't master something that's already been super compressed, smashed, because it's just going to sound worse. I'd rather my name not be on it than get the money. So I'll send that back. And then if there's serious mix flaws, I can't fix that. I can do small things, but if the vocal's just way too loud or there's just way too much low end, I mean, there are tools that I can do to EQ out, but I don't have control of the individual instruments. That's the mix engineer's job. So a pet peeve of mine is actually getting comments after I send masters back that are mix problems. Like, yeah, turn the snare down. I mean, I can mess with some EQ around the snare frequencies, but that's also going to affect, your guitars, your vocals, exactly. So no, I don't want to do that. That's something that you should have figured out before you sent to me, and I absolutely am going to charge you again after you remix it and then send it to me.
Yeah. Is there like an optimal level, like the output level of the mix that you would prefer?
We can all say our preferences, but let's work from baseline. I just need no digital overs. I need it to not go over 0. If it's going to be clipping, it's going to go over 0. I don't want it. I'm going to send that back. So it can't be clipping. That's the big thing. If you leave me where the peaks are between -3 and -6 dB, I would love it. That would give me plenty of headroom. But honestly, as long as it's not clipping, I can work with it, and it hasn't been pre-limited. Even some people will use a little bus compression, a little, they'll mix it on a console, or they'll have an SSL compressor, and that's fine if there's a little bit of tone there, as long as you're not killing all the dynamics. That's great.
Cool. So I guess we've already went over like what would be a horrible session, an MP3 distortion,
yes,
all of that. Cool. Give us a little bit like into your process of mastering. Like, how do you start and where you finish? Is there like a step-by-step thing? Compression, EQ, and
yeah. So it's very, very, very program dependent. Start that way. So I master a lot of different genres, so it's constantly different. Everything's different. There's two. Let's divide it. There's two major steps. One is what I call the transfer step, and so again, in the old days, that was different. That's getting from one medium to another medium, getting from tape to something else, or mastering to tape, or mastering to vinyl. Now, for me, it's just digital to digital, but I am transferring it from the computer to an array of outboard gear back into the computer, and we'll finish with some digital touches and get the song to where I think it sounds right, and that's on a one-by-one basis. But I also have that final step where I'm going to listen to all of these together in one global session. And that's I'm using Pro Tools because I've been using Pro Tools forever, but but a lot of mastering engineers are using a separate DAW specifically for mastering.
Oh, for mastering.
Yeah, for mastering. To me,
don't be recording in FL Studio. Okay?
Yeah, I don't think they're mastering in FL Studio.
Hey, so I was just on YouTube today, man. I was looking up some mastering stuff, and this one of the videos is how to master in FL Studio.
Okay. That's a little scary. So, yeah. So I'm going to pull them all in globally, and then I'm going to make subtle volume changes so the songs really work together as a cohesive group. May have to do some additional limiting. May hear, oh, this song is really sibilant. I'm going to have to grab a really a digital EQ that can stand out of the way where you're not going to hear it, and take some of that high end down or something like that, or maybe some de-essing. As far as hardware, I use a variety of different pieces of hardware. I have a couple different stages of low-level compression. And mastering, we're talking about very small ratios. So, you're mixing stuff, you might use 3:1 to 6:1 to 8:1 for whatever. We're talking 1.5 to 1, 1 3/4 to 1, maybe 2 to 1 if it's like crazy. I might have 2 stages of compression there. I typically have to EQ after compression to do some makeup. If I've taken away, especially the high end, maybe I got to put some high end back into that. But I mean, that's not a straight answer either. If I've got too much kick, and the kick is the only thing triggering that compressor, a lot of times I'll hit the EQ first, pull down some 60 hertz or whatever, and then feed the compressor. So I have analog EQ, analog compression that kind of changes the order, changes the pieces. I use a variety of different pieces to get that tone. And then once it gets back into the computer on the transfer on the way back in, I'll use digital limiting, where it's really not going to let anything over. And I usually do that with small stages as well. It might even use a multi-band compressor or a de-esser. I don't usually typically use multi-band across the whole frequency range, but may use that to just to get on like specific problems. Like if the mid-range needs, maybe just deal the mid-range. But typically I don't have a multi-band across the whole thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely does. So for somebody looking to possibly master their own records,
sure,
would you have like 3 do's and 3 don'ts?
I don't know. I've come up with 6 things.
I mean, whatever you got. Some do's and don'ts of mixing your own stuff, mastering your own stuff. Yeah,
mastering your own stuff. I think the first thing is your focus really needs to be taken off of volume. People get so obsessed about volume that they can't hear. Well, our ears naturally, like when we hear something louder, we naturally gravitate to that sounds better. And so work on making it sound right, and then worry about trying to get some additional volume. But if you just start pulling down that limiter and there's all that distortion in there, your ears may not even be trained to hear it, but you're squashing the dynamics. Take the focus off extreme volume, because you're really going to destroy your mix if you have extreme limiting and extreme everything to the extreme. I said extreme like 8 times there, so
don't be too extreme.
Everything's subtle. So again, mixing, you may boost 6 dB on something. Man, you're never going to boost 6 decibels on I don't know of a time that I've had to boost 6 or 8 decibels, because that's affecting everything in that mix. So we're doing most analog mastering EQs are stepped in half dB increments. Sometimes even like the API can go down to like a 1/4 dB steps. Little tiny increments where you're boosting subtly, cutting subtly, but everything subtle, and try to take the focus off extreme volume and get something that has nice even tone across the board.
Okay. Are there any tools that you would recommend for mastering? It could be digital or analog. I know one of your favorites.
Man, well, we're limited to a little bit of what we've had experience using before. So, unfortunately, there's tons of super high-end gear and $12,000 and $20,000 compressors and EQs that I haven't had the luxury of using before. I can kind of tell you what I use, and we'll go from there. Some of my favorite pieces of gear that I use is an Avalon 747. Very accessible as far as price. Very, very tweaky. It works when it works, but man, you can't stray too far. Like if it starts taking off more than a decibel, that thing starts sounding weird. So I really love the tone of the box, and I use it very subtly, just shaving off a couple of decibels. but sometimes not even the compressor in it, but the EQ is very nice. And a very affordable box for as good as the tone is. I use the API 2500 bus compressor. We have the vintage design VDC, which is a Neve S compressor, the Pendulum Audio, all different compressors that I may strap across the mix bus, all doing different things, having different tones.
So is this like, this is the mastering rack?
That's mostly what we have. I also have some of the stuff behind here too,
Okay.
but I may use...
I'll get it on the B-roll.
I will use the API 2500. I may use a pair of distressors actually in parallel, never on the master, but the main pass, but maybe in parallel I'll use a couple distressors. I also really like conversion is very, very important, having something super clean. But this one actually is also harmonically enhanced, hence the name HED, harmonically enhanced digital device. So super high-end conversion, but also I can add tape saturation, and it actually, to me, sounds like tape. So that's some of my hardware favorites. For sure, or some of the tools that I use quite a bit. Software? You want to talk about software?
Yeah, what if you had to master all the way in the box, man? NFL Studio.
Yeah, I mean, you can master it. I mean, that's the thing, is it's not... All right, so before I even leave the computer, I've got a couple plugins sitting here. The main one just being my trim, selector, and I have this unlinked, so I can do minor adjustments between the left and right side. So I can do some dipping, some offsets between the left and right side. That's typically not a problem with the mix that I've received from the mix engineer, but after I pass it through a bunch of analog gear, that center image may drift a little bit, and I'm doing subtle correction with that. You can also see I've got a main and what I call a compressed track. And this is going to be a parallel of the same thing. So I'll grab my grabber tool, and I will Control-Option drop it. That way I can't slide it out of place if I've got that control down there. And so I've got a copy of this in exact time, all lined up, and I may do some pretty heavy compression then with that. So you can see those meters are really smashing that quite a bit, whereas the other one's not compressed at all. And that way I can pull that average up a little bit without messing my peaks too much. Okay, and that's all before I'm leaving the computer. And then those have the exact same output, going through all that analog gear that we've talked about. From the analog, I'll do most of my what I call big picture compression in broad strokes, EQ and compression, where I'm doing most of the corrective EQ, but anything that I have to get really tight and focused on, I may follow up with a digital EQ. The main thing about, well, maybe not the main thing, but one of the main things I'm going to be checking is my mono capability. I really, and to do that, even though I've got some meters to do that, I'm really just flipping it between mono. Is this mix going to, or is this final master going to translate to mono? That's one of the biggest things that we've kind of lost in this day and age, is making sure that our mixes are going to translate to mono. It's going to be really, really, it's more important now than ever, because we've got, someone may play something on their telephone, they may hold it up to you to play it to you. It may be something where, hey Google, play this, and they only got one speaker there. It's got to sound great on everything, so making sure you have mono capability. Once it gets back into the computer, I'm going to do some subtle limiting. I don't really have favorite limiters. I have some that I don't like, but right now a lot of people don't like the L2 because it's got a little bit of tone to it. I actually like it quite a bit, but I'm just using everything very subtly, and I've got a couple of them stacked here. I may not use the L2. I may use something a little more transparent, like a Massey limiter. And then my favorite limiter that I'm going to be using at the very end is actually the FabFilter Pro L. One of the great things about, turn the help off, what's going on there? Here, let's get this playing here. So one of the great things about this FabFilter is I can unlink the transients. So You know, if you got something going back and forth between the left and the right side, you're not tripping the limiter a bunch. You're tripping one side of the limiter. You can completely unlimit them. You've got true look ahead limiting, so you can make sure no peaks go over. You've got oversampling. It can be very clean, but there's also a lot of great settings on that. I've got the Waves analyzer, which I use quite a bit, but I'll use some more expensive stuff as well. But I just like the way this is. You can kind of see where my EQ is going right now. This is with no EQ on it. You could see that there's a nice low mid dip. This is pretty common in songs. Maybe that's a little too much, kind of depends. We'd have to really listen to it. You can also see that there might be a little bit of a peak right there and some of that to correct. Again, we're not going to just look at that and make assumptions, and that's a lot of what software does, and those like software-based mastering services. They just have some sort of a logarithm and they make everything look. We'll use this as a reference, but that won't be my only thing I'm looking at. I also love FabFilter plugins. You can see I'm getting some of that analog noise coming back in. But I use the multiband mainly as a de-esser. So if I've got too much high end, I can adjust where the high end is hitting too hard. Again, obviously I'm doing this blind right now, but I would listen to this. I can adjust threshold ratio, everything. But I can control S's. I can control hi-hats that are out of control, which is very common, without just destroying it, without just turning down 7K, because that may not be the proper way to do that. I will use a little bit of dither because typically I'm preparing CD masters, so anytime I'm going from 24-bit to 16-bit, I'll use a little bit of dither. I use a lot of EQs, but this is one of my favorite ones, the Brainworks EQ, and I'm actually going to use it in mid-side. And so that means instead of EQing the left and right channels, I'm EQing the mids and I'm EQing the sides separately. Now I'm going to keep them linked so that it's, one's not messing up the other. But one of the tricks I do, or not really a trick, it's pretty common practice, is I'm really going to filter out the lows out of that stereo section, out of the sides, and that way. If that mix is going to vinyl, I'm not going to have stereo subs that are really going to mess up those grooves. So it's very important that you filter out those sides and have some mono-based correlation. And we can see that with this Flux Analyzer plugin. We can see how mono it is when it gets to sub-frequencies, and then it gets spread out stereo as it gets higher. But if this has too much stereo information, the master won't work on vinyl. Now, not everything's going to vinyl, but I want to make sure that it'll work. I don't believe in mastering for specific mediums. I will take some certain considerations in if I know something's going to vinyl or something's going to Spotify, where I can get away with some more dynamic range, or Spotify exclusively. But typically, I want a good master that sounds good across the board. If it sounds good somewhere, it's going to sound good everywhere, and that's kind of my philosophy. You can see I've got some extensive EQ analysis on this Flux Analyzer. I also have some volume things going on right now. I haven't pumped this quite up yet, but if I mess with the gain here a little bit, we can see what our short-term and long-term and integrated volumes are. A lot of people look for a certain number. That's not what I'm doing. I'm using this as a little bit of a reference, so when I'm bouncing track to track, I kind of know what's going on. And I also, again, have the mono stereo capability, observing to make sure that everything's working in mono as well. So those are some of the plugins I'm using. It's certainly not exclusively, but some of the things that you can be using as well. But honestly, when you're using low-level compression, when we're using small amounts of compression, it just needs to be clean. It needs to be transparent, and it needs to not exhibit a lot of tone. So you could use stock digi compressors. You can use a C1, anything like that. But the name of the game is to make sure that everything is subtle and that it's going to translate from medium to medium and speaker system to speaker system. I hope that helped.
So that's a little insight on, you know, how to master, some of the tools that could be used for mastering, and what mastering is in general. All right. Hopefully you got something out of that. I want to thank Ben for you know, chopping it up with us today. Ben, tell the people where they can find you, because I'm sure they're gonna need some records mastered.
The best way to contact me is through email, through electronic mail. Ben.Kesler with only one S, Kesler @gmail. Always the best way to contact me. And you know, I'll be straightforward with my rates and all that stuff. But yeah, ask me. I'll prepare a quote for you. Ben.Kesler @gmail.com. I'm sure you can find lots of my work online and around.
Cool. And I'll leave some links. I'll write that email in there too. Just make sure you get the spelling right. And I'll leave some links to some sample work that you can check out.
Absolutely.
And you know, be dope.